Microphones. I consider two major categories of microphones. There's the dynamic microphones and the condenser type microphones. Condenser microphones are sometimes called capacitor microphones, as well as condensers, either way. And dynamic microphones, there's two categories of dynamic microphones. One category is moving coil dynamic, which is like a mini little speaker inside of the microphone that is a diaphragm that moves with a coil of wire around it, that moves it through a magnetic field that allows some current to flow. The other type is a ribbon microphone, which is basically a thin ribbon of metal that actually, when air hits it, it moves through a magnetic field. Not a coil of wire, just the diaphragm is made of very thin metal. It's more sensitive than a moving coil dynamic because there's less mass on the diaphragm. When you've got a diaphragm and a coil of wire wrapped around it, it's going to be heavier and more massive, so it'll take more energy to move it, which means it'll have less high frequency content because it will be able to produce less high frequency because high frequencies have less energy. This all ties into week one all over again. So your microphones that are more sensitive are the condenser microphones. They can record higher frequencies and be more sensitive because they're very small light capsules and they only need to move a little bit to change the charge from plate to plate. So the good quality of a moving coil dynamic like an SM57 is that it's really durable. You can have it on a stage and drop it and it still works. Everything's great. I've seen people pound nails in with them on a stage when they didn't have a hammer and put it up, and then the guy sang into it and it worked fine. The bad part about it is that they're so durable that it takes a lot of sound energy to make them active, so they don't have as good of a high frequency characteristic. But they're great for drums, they're great for electric guitars, loud instruments. There's a lot of energy moving that the diaphragm. Where condenser microphones have a much better frequency response, so they're better to make things sound more lifelike because the higher frequency response you have, the better the higher harmonic character of the sound comes through. And so that makes it sound more lifelike, more real. Harmonic content makes one sound like a piano, one sound like an acoustic guitar. So that's why you've got both sides of the coin there, and they're both useful for different things. So a condenser mic is more sensitive, which means it has a better frequency response. Bad side of that is I wouldn't use a condenser mic on an electric guitar. I'd blow it up because it's too sensitive. We talked about microphone pickup patterns. We talked about the cardioid, which looks like an upside-down heart, right? It's fairly directional in one way. The omnidirectional, omni mic is directional in all directions, picks up from all directions. Then there's the figure eight, which picks up basically from two directions, or the bidirectional. And then there's hypercardioids and all that are much more focused in one direction. So we talked about polar patterns. We talked about mic positioning techniques, mono mic positioning techniques. Let's say you've got an electric guitar and you're miking it up with a microphone. You could put it real close. That would be a close miking situation. Put it about 2 feet away. That would be a distant miking position. You put it in the room, like 10 feet away, and that's more of an ambient miking position. If there's a special quality you want to capture in what you're doing, and you put a specific position to capture one specific part of the sound, that would be called an accent mic. I use an accent mic to accent mic ride cymbals in a drum kit, or I use an accent mic to capture maybe on a cello if I want to hear the grit of the bow moving across the strings. I'll put a special mic right at where the bow hits the string, and then I'll put a more distant mic to capture the entire sound. So something that I want to have a little more control over, because most sounds aren't just the same everywhere. If you move your ear, even on an acoustic guitar, from the back to where the fingering is, and just as somebody's playing, just move your head and hear the difference, it sounds different in all positions. And the way that I like to mic an acoustic guitar is with a single mic, right at the right position where I get enough of each kind of sound quality to blend together into one sound. It's how you'd hear it if I was playing guitar here in the room and you were sitting 5-6 feet away. The problem is that some people try to capture all the different elements of a sound and using accent mics, and that's, I guess, theoretically good, But in practical terms, to me, all you get is a lot of phasing, because the sound is being heard by all of the mics from all the different parts of the instrument. If we're talking about an acoustic guitar, putting a mic in the back and in the front and around and out, and too many mics creates all this phasing problems because of the distance differences. And that brings us to the stereo miking techniques. Stereo miking techniques, there's a couple that I favor over the others, but there's a whole list of them. One of them is the coincident XY, I call it, positioning, where they're at right angles, and one mic, and they're cardioid mics, and one microphone carries and captures one side, left side, and the other mic captures the other side, the right side and left side, and they're in the same position physically. So sound coming from the left or coming from the right hits the mics all at the same time because the two mics are not separated. And then there's the left-right technique, where you put one mic on the left side and one mic on the right side of, say, an orchestra or a drum kit overhead or a choir. And I don't favor that as much because of the obvious phasing that would happen, because one mic's in a different position than another. And if you get one sound that is predominant from one side, one mic's going to pick it up more than the other, but you add those two mics together and they're going to phase to some degree. That said, there are times when you want to encourage phasing, like in an orchestra. When you've got 20 violins playing in unison, there's going to be phasing because not everybody's playing perfectly in time together and perfectly in pitch together. And so that's what creates the sound of an orchestra, the sound of a section. So sometimes you want to encourage phasing, but generally those are my two favored types of miking. And then there's the M+S, which is mid-side. So there's one mic in the center, and it is omnidirectional, picking up in all directions, and in the same position is a figure-8 microphone, picking up left and right. So you get a left and a right microphone, and you get a center microphone. I don't like that so much because you don't have any control over loudness from left to right, even though there's no extra phasing because they're all in the same position. And then there's the exotic types like the Decca Tree, which is an array of microphones on a predestined positionings. Somebody designed that kind of a miking technique for orchestras and high fidelity, but I honestly, personally, don't really use it much. And then there's the Blumen technique. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's two figure-8 mics in an XY pattern. So one mic picks up left-right, one mic picks up front-back. I don't use that much either because I don't need to mic a whole room, and if I did, I'd use one Omni mic. But I'm sure that there's reasons why people design these techniques, not just like theoretical. Going back to digital and such, we talked about the Nyquist frequency. That's an important thing to remember because the Nyquist frequency basically tells you how high of a frequency you can record into your digital recording device. The Nyquist frequency is the highest frequency that can be accurately recorded without having any sort of aliasing or alien frequencies creeping into your recording. The Nyquist frequency is 1/2 the sample rate. That's why when you sample at 44.1 kilohertz, the highest frequency you can get out of that is 20.5 kilohertz. We talked briefly about how a CD works and how a vinyl album works. They record in a spiral. And the speed of the rotation of the vinyl disc determines how much information can fit on the disc and the width of the groove. And the groove is just bumps that the needle rides in. And as it rides in there, it wiggles a magnet over a coil just like a dynamic microphone does, creates a signal. And you generally would get 22 minutes a side. 18 to 22. I remember because I used to take an album, a full album, and put it on one side of a 90-minute cassette, which was 45 minutes a side, and it would always fit. With a CD, on the other hand, you can go up to 70 minutes, some longer. And the way a CD works is it also records it in a spiral fashion on the disc, and the laser bounces through the bottom plastic layer of the disc and either reflects back or doesn't reflect back based upon the pits in the burning that's happened. And a consumer CD, which we're sort of not using anymore, really. I don't know many people that use CDs anymore, but a consumer CD is 44.1 kilohertz sample rate and 16-bit depth. We can work at much faster sample rates and higher bit depths. And the bit depth, that's an interesting thing to remember too, is that 16-bit means 2 to the 16th numbers of different values. We did talk about MIDI, and I think that MIDI is something that most people are fairly familiar with in their DAWs if you're using any sort of MIDI programming. But MIDI is basically just a digital language that captures parameters of a performance. So if I'm playing piano, a MIDI piano, I can capture what my performance was, how hard I hit the key, how long I held it down, how fast I released it, which key I was playing, and so on. And then I can take that digital information and apply it to other sounds. Just capturing the generic parameters of a performance and not the specific notes is what made it special when you program, because you don't have to decide which sound you're going to use as you record it. You can program it and then try different types of sounds to give you different emotional feelings. The other thing about MIDI is that they're system exclusive, so various manufacturers have specific encoded MIDI messages which can do things like automate recording consoles, automate light boards in a live concert, automate program changes for a guitar player, so you can step on a pedal and all your effects change to the next song if you program it that way. So it's a pretty versatile kind of language, MIDI, and now they're working on the next iteration of MIDI, which will probably be wireless mic position. But let's just say we were going to record a choir, and I've recorded choirs using an XY and a left-right. Works great. And then sometimes I use a mono technique by putting one mono mic in each section, the tenors, the baritones, the bass, and the sopranos. Because if there's ever a soloist who needs to be heard, I want to have a mic close to them. So I'll use a combination of stereo and mono miking techniques for some things. In miking a piano, I mic it right over the hammers, but I mic it in an XY fashion, and then I'll step back and use a mono mic about 8 feet away just to capture the ambience of what the piano sounds like and blend those together. So you cannot be limited to one type of these techniques. You can mix and match at will. But as I said, use as few mics as possible to get the sound that you want, because just by throwing extra mics up, you create more problems than help yourself. You create more phasing issues, more problems in that regard than being able to capture all the little different nuances and then trying to decide later. You really want to decide what sound you want as you record it. You can always re-record it. But making decisions as you go rather than leaving them till later is always a wise thing. Always wise. People don't do that because they're scared they're going to box themselves into a corner. But the truth is that once you get comfortable with the process, you know that you're going to end up with a good product, because you're not going to let the next stage happen until it is good. And it's better to decide now than later. And that only comes from my own personal experience of having 5 solos on the project, and then in the mix, somebody had to decide. And we were forced at the very end, before the mix was complete, to make these decisions. And the problem is that other layers went on, and we didn't know what the music was really going to sound like until the mix. So you're recording things that may or may not be there. And so the singer's singing to things that may or may not be there. So I believe that the authenticity of the performance is compromised that way. The authenticity of the performers that come after you don't make a decision. That's just my rationalization. It's a lot easier to make decisions and then go back and change a performance if you want to. Oh, I didn't want piano. I wanted electric piano, not acoustic piano. Go back and re-record it. But making those decisions as you go along limits your options, and in my opinion, that's always best, is to start out with where you want it to go and then constantly focus towards getting there, rather than just starting and hoping you land somewhere good. It's like trying to travel from New York to LA and not knowing which direction you start off in. You can go east and eventually end up in LA, but it's a lot better if you focus on where you're going and try to continually go there, even if you take a few wrong turns on the way. My philosophy. That's just mine, so take it for what it's worth.